Okay, so have you ever had that experience where something that uh, used to totally dread or hate just like completely flips for you
Hmm.
and you actually start to enjoy it?
Yeah, like what kind of thing are you thinking of?
Oh, gosh, so many things, right? It could be like public speaking, something that a lot of people are afraid of, or maybe like a certain type of exercise that you just never really got into, but then suddenly it clicks, or even like a food, Like when you were a kid, you couldn't stand Brussels sprouts, but now you're all about them.
Right, right. Yeah, I get it. Those things that your brain kind of had a negative association with, and then it somehow reevaluates them. And it's like, wait a minute, this is actually good.
Exactly. And it really makes you wonder what's going on in our brains when that happens, especially when it comes to those things that are kind of hardwired, like things our brain flags as dangerous. How do we learn that something's not a threat anymore?
That's a really fundamental question. And
Yeah.
it gets to the heart of how our brains have evolved to help us survive. It's this incredible ability to adapt and update our responses to the world around us.
Yeah. For sure. And there's some really cool new research that digs right into this. We've been looking at this report from Neuroscience News about a study that was supported by the BIL Foundation and published in Nature Communications. And what's really exciting is that these researchers use some super advanced brain imaging techniques to actually watch what happens in the brains of mice as they're learning about different stimuli. Like they're literally getting down to the level of individual brain cells.
It's amazing what they can do with these imaging techniques now. And what makes this study so insightful is that they can see the activity of specific types of neurons in real time. So instead of just seeing a whole brain region light up on an fMRI scan, they could actually observe what individual cells were doing as the mice were learning.
Yeah, and for those of you listening, this isn't just about some, high-level science that doesn't really relate to your life. What we're going to do in this deep dive is give you a real understanding of how your own brain learns and remembers, especially when it comes to those negative associations that we all pick up along the way. So if you've ever wondered why, you just can't seem to shake a certain fear, even when, logically there's no real danger anymore, well, this research might just shed some light on that.
Absolutely. And understanding these basic mechanisms of how the brain updates its sort of threat assessment system could be incredibly valuable in helping people who struggle with anxiety, PTSD, those kinds of things.
Exactly. So let's get into it. Our mission today is to unpack how different types of neurons in this really key area of the brain respond when we encounter both good and bad things. Pleasurable and unpleasant experiences, and how that helps us adapt to the world around us constantly. So, okay, first things first. The brain is always taking in information, right? It's like this nonstop evaluation machine. Is this good for me, bad for me? Approach. Avoid.
Right, and that's really the most fundamental function of the brain. It's constantly assessing incoming stimuli to determine if they're potentially beneficial or harmful.
Yeah.
And this drive to approach rewarding things, what we call appetitive stimuli, things that we want or need, and avoid threatening things, which are aversive stimuli, things we want to stay away from, that's absolutely essential for survival.
It's like a super sophisticated internal risk management system that's always running in the background.
Exactly, and it's incredibly complex. We're talking billions of neurons working together
Yeah.
to make these evaluations.
Wow, billions. Okay. So where does this all happen in the brain? Is there like a central command center for this kind of processing?
Well, there's several areas involved, but one of the most important ones is a region called the nucleus accumbens. Sometimes it's shortened to NAC.
The neck. Okay. So what's so special about this nucleus accumbens?
The nucleus accumbens is like a central hub for motivation, reward, and aversion. Think of it as the place where your brain weighs options and makes decisions about what to do next in response to the information it's receiving. And for quite a while now, researchers have been trying to figure out the exact roles of different types of neurons within the NAC in this evaluation process, particularly two main types called D1 and D2 neurons.
Ah, okay. So that's where this new research comes in, right?
Precisely. This is where it gets really interesting.
Okay. So they use this real-time imaging in mice, which is just mind-blowing to me that they can actually watch individual brain cells in action. And they tracked the activity of hundreds of these D1 and D2 neurons in the anaca as the mice were exposed to both rewarding and threatening stimuli.
And what they found is that both the D1 and the D2 neurons responded to both types of experiences.
So it's not like the D1 neurons only fired when something good happened and the D2 neurons only fired when something bad happened.
Nope, it wasn't that simple. For the first time, they were able to demonstrate in such detail that both of these neuron populations are active when the brain is processing both positive and negative stimuli. It suggests they're both involved in the initial learning about whether something is good or bad for us.
Interesting. So it's more nuanced than maybe they originally thought?
Right, exactly. And it actually raises even more questions about how these different neuron types are working together. But one of the really important findings of this study is that D2 neurons have a really critical role when it comes to unlearning those negative associations.
Okay, so both types are involved in the initial learning, like when our brain first makes that connection between a stimulus and a reward or a punishment. But then the D2 neurons step in when those links need to be adjusted or broken.
You got it. The researchers actually use the term extinguishing to describe this process of weakening or eliminating those aversive associations. So when something that used to be unpleasant stops being unpleasant, the D2 neurons are the ones that help our brain register that change.
Ah, extinguishing. That makes sense. So like the negative association is fading away.
Exactly. It's like the brain is saying, okay, this thing is not a threat anymore. We can relax.
Mhm.
And the D2 neurons are crucial in making that happen.
Wow. I'm starting to see how important these little D2 neurons are. And the article used a really good example to illustrate this, the sound of fireworks.
Oh, yeah, that's a powerful one.
Yeah, for most people, fireworks are associated with celebration, happy times. But for someone who's been in combat, that same sound can trigger a really intense fear response. It brings back traumatic memories, even if they're in a totally safe environment now.
Right. That's because their brain has learned to associate that sound with danger. It's a conditioned fear response. And it really highlights how our past experiences shape our perception of the world.
Totally. So the sound of fireworks is actually neutral in itself, but past experience gives it a very negative meaning for some people. And so what the D2 neurons are doing is helping the brain update that meaning in new contexts. They're helping the person learn that these particular fireworks right now are not a threat.
It's like the D2 neurons are saying, hey, wait a minute, we've been in similar situations before and nothing bad happened. Maybe we can chill out a bit.
I love that. Okay, so if those D2 neurons aren't working effectively, it makes sense why someone might have a really hard time overcoming those negative associations. Even when logically they know they're safe now, their brain is still stuck in that fear mode. And this is where it gets really interesting when we start thinking about mental health conditions like anxiety and PTSD.
Absolutely. The researchers actually make a direct link between these difficulties in modifying negative associations and those conditions. One of the lead researchers, Karina Soares-Kuna, says, since difficulties in modifying negative associations are linked to anxiety and post-traumatic stress, better understanding the function of D2 neurons could help develop new treatments.
That's huge. So by getting a much clearer understanding of how these D2 neurons work, this research could be a big step towards developing therapies that specifically target those mechanisms in people who are struggling with these really debilitating conditions.
Exactly. Instead of taking a more generalized approach to treatment, we might be able to develop more precise interventions that focus on supporting the function of D2 neurons to help weaken or extinguish those persistent fear responses that are no longer adaptive.
Wow, that's a game changer. So thinking more broadly about this research, what does it tell us about the overall functioning of the brain?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is that the brain is incredibly adaptable. It's not static. It's constantly taking in new information and adjusting its responses based on our experiences throughout our lives. And this study also highlights just how complex those neural circuits involved in learning and memory actually are. We're not talking about just one type of neuron acting in isolation. It's this incredibly intricate and dynamic interplay between different populations of cells all working together.
It's amazing to think about how this is all happening constantly without us even being aware of it. It's like a whole symphony of neurons going on in our heads all the time.
It really is. And this is a good time to give a shout out to the research team behind this amazing work. Ana Joan Rodriguez, Karina Soares-Kuna Rui Costa, and Gabriela Martins from institutions like ICVS, Uminio Columbia University, and the Allen Institute. This kind of detailed research requires a lot of collaboration and expertise.
For sure. And of course, we can't forget to mention the organizations that funded this research. The BIL Foundation, the European Research Council La Caixa Foundation, and the Foundation for Science and Technology. It's so important to acknowledge their support for this kind of groundbreaking science.
Couldn't agree more. Scientific progress really depends on this kind of investment and vision. And it's fantastic that their findings were published in such a prestigious journal like Nature Communications. It really adds to the impact and visibility of this work.
So to wrap this all up for our listeners, what would you say is like the key takeaway from this research?
Okay, so the key takeaway is this. In the nucleus accumbens, Both D1 and D2 neurons become active when we encounter things that we perceive as either good or bad. But D2 neurons have a particularly important role in helping us learn when something that used to be dangerous is no longer a threat. They're essential for updating those negative associations and basically telling our brains, hey, it's all right to calm down now.
And this is especially relevant when we think about anxiety and PTSD, where this process of extinguishing those fear responses seems to be disrupted or malfunctioning in some way. And by getting a better understanding of how D2 neurons work, this research opens up all sorts of possibilities for developing more effective treatments for those conditions.
Absolutely. And it brings us full circle back to that idea of how our reactions to things can change so dramatically over time. It's pretty remarkable. This research gives us a much deeper understanding of the biological mechanisms that make this adaptability possible, particularly when it comes to overcoming fear and those stubborn negative memories that can hold us back.
It really makes you think. So if we're starting to figure out the specific neurons that are involved in reclassifying danger, how might this impact our understanding of learning and memory more broadly? Like, could these same D2 neurons play a role in other types of unlearning or changing our habits?
That's a fascinating question. It would make sense if these mechanisms were involved in other forms of learning and adaptation. We certainly don't have all the answers yet, but it's exciting to consider the possibilities.
Right. And considering how the brain is constantly reevaluating things and how important these D2 neurons are in helping us let go of negative associations, it makes you wonder how much control we might have over this process in our own lives. Maybe there are things we can do consciously or unconsciously to encourage that extinction of negative thoughts and feelings.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this research gives us a lot to think about in terms of how our brains work and the potential for new discoveries that can improve mental well-being.
It really does. Food for thought, for sure.